announce that we now have an Amazon Smile account, and we're going to be putting a link for you with some information if you'd like to participate in that. And finally, if you're a Connecticut resident and not a member of the Reading League Connecticut chapter, please join. And we'll put a link in the chat so that you can get to that as well. So now that the housekeeping is taken care of, I'm really delighted that we have Dr. Michelle Hosp here with us this evening. She's Associate Professor of Special Education at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Scientific Advisor for Key Phonics, which I hope we'll be hearing more about this evening, author of numerous articles, chapters, and books, including CBM and CBE, all caught up in the book, The ABCs of CBM. So if you can sort out all those letters, you're ahead of the game tonight. And of course, and I think this is really important, she was the author of the blog for CORE, the Consortium on Reading Excellence, that we happened to see a few weeks ago that just caught our attention because of the timeliness of it. And this is the blog that we sent out, which is We Still Have Time, How to Support Students' Reading Skills in 2022. So we just seized the moment, got in touch with Michelle, and because it's such a timely topic, we were able to get on the agenda really quickly. So we have as much time left this year to actually talk about this topic and do something about this topic. So Michelle asked if we could do this kind of in a Q&A style. So we're going to start out. I'm going to ask the questions. She's going to do the answers, thankfully. But whenever there's something that you might like elaborated upon, please let us know. So, we have to start, Michelle, if we could, with in your blog, you call the achievement lag from interrupted learning due to the pandemic a crisis. What makes this a crisis? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. And thank you, everyone. It's after 7 o'clock and you guys are tuning in. So I really appreciate that. And it's my pleasure to be here supporting all of your hard work. So it's interesting, when CORE asked me to write the blog, I was looking at other recent blogs that were going around, and there was this sense of urgency, right? Of we have been in this unprecedented, almost 2 years now for our kids, and the disruption that it has caused for families, for teachers, for kids is really huge. And we're seeing that in our data. We're seeing that if you think about second graders, these kids had an interrupted kindergarten year and an interrupted first grade year. And when we really think about those, we're all familiar with the term learning to read, to reading to learn. And so those years really got impacted. And I think the reason why it's a crisis is that those consequences that are likely to happen because of this interruption in learning are staggering. And I think they're real. There's research to support them, and I'm going to mention what they are, but everybody should, I hope, have a true sense of urgency that this huge disruption has happened. If we don't pay attention and try to mitigate or remediate or fill in those holes as quickly as possible, we're going to see some pretty devastated consequences for some of our kids, and particularly for our most at-risk populations as well. And so those really come to, we know that kids who struggle in reading and don't have a good foundation in reading continue to struggle throughout school. They're more likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to end up incarcerated and in, the corrections, school to prison pipeline. They're less likely to have well-paying jobs, access to healthcare. Like, all of these things can be directly attributed to kids' reading skills. So it's real. It's And I don't think we should say, well, let's hope it all works out okay. Well, those are going to be, I hear people talk about it as those are going to be our COVID kids. And I'm like, oh, so what does that mean? Those are the kids that don't graduate. Those are the kids, that don't get good jobs. What does that mean? And so I think we have an opportunity to kind of sit up and think about how are we going to do this? It's hard. It's really hard work. I give so much credit to our teachers who show up every day and do this because they care about their kids and they know that it matters. And I think we have to support them because those consequences from this crisis are they're too big.
Well, given what you just said, how big a crisis this is, what can or should our goals be for this year? I mean, I think we have to sort of come back to perhaps a scale, like what could we be doing? I thought that's what your blog was so captivating about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So yes, it's overwhelming. And I think sometimes it's like the deer in the headlights, right? We're like, it's so bad, we don't know where to begin. And I'll share some stories of just, some districts I was talking to this week about their data and how they're working interventions and what's working, what isn't. So we'll hopefully get to talk about that a little bit later, but really focusing on, so the thing that always amazes me is that teachers have the power for every minute they have kids in front of them in a classroom. They have an opportunity to encourage and to teach. And it's that masterful teacher that seizes those opportunities and understands that every instructional minute is precious. And honestly, I think we need to be thinking about that, right? We need to be thinking about every minute of our instruction counts, and we can't waste that time. There should be this real sense of urgency, again, because we're in this crisis, and we have to really be thoughtful about that. So some things that I really think we can do is make sure, first off, we have good data, right? We can't just say, well, we know our kids are so far behind, we're not even going to bother testing them. I hear this and I'm thinking, okay, but you don't know how far behind they are, and you don't know, what the road is, what the path is leading forward. So I think having really good data to help understand what skills that our students really do need help with, because if we only have so many instructional minutes, it's really helpful to match those instructional minutes to what the kids need most instead of trying to guess. Making sure that our tier 1 instruction is really solid and is following the science of reading. I also think that making sure our tier 2 instruction is really focused on those high priority skills. So those skills that we know have more, I just want to use the word oomph, I don't know why, but just have more power to them, right? Of if kids had these core set of foundational skills, we know that those are such solid blocks that we can start building on those. So I think really understanding for our tier 2 of really honing in on those really foundational skills that are necessary for our kids to advance in reading. An example of this that I'll share is, so if we think about kids who don't yet know the correct sounds for short vowels, but let's say they're in our curriculum, we're working on R-controlled vowels or vowel teams. Well, those kids are not going to be good served if we say, well, they didn't, they don't quite know that, we're just going to keep going. Because if we look at our English language, there are so many words that our kids are going to come across with short vowels, not only in our single syllable words, but when they start reading multisyllabic words, those short vowels are going to show up over and over and over. And so we have to spend time going back and making sure those skills are really solid. So really understanding where our kids are at and really focusing on those skills that are necessary for those foundations. We also have to have the right tools, right? So we have to have the right assessments along with our instructional materials, right? It's like we need both of those things so that our teachers really can do what they do best, which is really the art of teaching, right? They inspire, they make their lessons come alive, they connect to where their kids are at, they make it relevant for them. We shouldn't be asking our teachers to develop assessments and come up with lessons on their own. It's just, I don't think, a really good use of their time, especially because every minute they have, they should be thinking about where are my kids and how can I use the hopefully good materials and assessments I have to really do the job of teaching.
Well, that sort of segues into some of us, probably many of us, had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to hear the Reading League launch the Defining Movement book. And in that, one of the presentations, they suggested we use assessment to know what to do with whom. I think in light of what you were just saying, could you talk about to the types of tools and the ways that that data can actually help address this crisis? In other words, how do we make that connection?
Yeah. So, and I went back and listened to that kickoff event too, and it was wonderful. And there were some amazing speakers, and I was really moved by a lot of what people were saying, and the focus on assessments, right? And so it's, it's funny. I'll just tell a quick story. So I actually started off in education as a school psychologist, and and I realized really quickly that I wasn't really helpful because I was only confirming what teachers already knew, that a kid was struggling. And I was spending, 3 hours testing a kid, giving them these crazy assessments that didn't tell the teacher why the student was struggling and didn't even tell the teacher what to teach the kid. And it's interesting because it really got me thinking, wow, this is not a really good use of time for a kid, and it's not helping the teacher. And it's actually what drove me to go back and get my PhD, is to understand a better way to assess kids. Because what I really feel like teachers are asking for and need is, tell me what this kid needs to be taught. Tell me where those holes are. Not, I know the kid is struggling. I know the kid is at risk. But sometimes we think we know that, but we don't also. So it really does speak to, we have to have a really good assessment. I like to refer to it as an assessment net. So there's lots of things that we need to assess and lots of different reasons. So I think for me, the best way to talk about assessments is, so what are the questions, right? What are the questions that people have? And often we think about, yes, we need to know, are our kids proficient on, grade level content? So we often refer to those as our outcome assessments. Those are our state level tests. In Massachusetts, it's our MCAS, right? And those are important because we are teaching content to kids and we do have expectations. And so those assessments are important, but they're not going to tell us what to teach. And they're not designed to do that. So then we also need to figure out, particularly, right, if we're in this crisis, because we have kids that didn't get the opportunity to be with their amazing teachers and have all those wonderful instructional minutes really intact. So what are the most critical things? So I think universal screening assessments. So those assessments are going to help us figure out which students are at risk for future failure. So it's a way to take a kid's temperature in their current space and time. And it is predictive of how they might do at the end of the year on like a state outcome assessment. So those assessments are really critical. And when we think about those, so some examples of those assessments, I like to, some of my favorites are curriculum-based measurements, just because I really understand and appreciate all of the work that goes into building those types of assessments. So those are things you guys might be familiar with, like DIBELS or AIMSweb or Easy CBM or FastBridge or Star CBM. There's lots and lots of good CBM types assessments that are universal screeners. There are also other types of universal screeners that I think are worth mentioning. So there are some computer adaptive universal screeners. So things like Star Reading, iReady, iStation, those types of assessments. And I think that they both of those types of universal screening assessments do a good job of identifying who's at risk. I think one of the things schools need to consider, and we need to consider in education, is we only have so many minutes. So what is the most quick, efficient way to get that information? And so maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. But I want to also mention that, so it's not just, so we want to know, are our kids, so back to the questions, are our kids meeting grade level expectations? Are they learning the content, right? Those are our outcome assessments. Which of our kids are at risk? Those are our universal screening assessments. But then for those students who are at risk, what do they need to be taught, right? So those are our diagnostic assessments. We don't need to give diagnostic assessments to every kid. That's just crazy because some kids are plodding along. And we know that because we have universal screening data. We know that because teachers are using informal assessments. They might have assessments that are built into their curriculum. So they know that the kids are healthy and that they're continuing. When I talk about healthy, I think about their reading health, right? That they are continuing to grow as readers. So, but for those kids who are struggling and we don't know what to teach them, then of course a diagnostic assessment. So that question is, what do I need to teach this kid? What does this particular student need? And diagnostic assessments are really helpful for that. Key phonics, I think, is a really good example of a really nice phonics diagnostic assessment. But then the other type of assessment that often people forget to think about is, so is this kid making progress? So I now have identified who's at risk. I've identified what they need to be taught. I need to now understand, are they getting better, right? Is their reading health improving? And so progress monitoring assessments are really, really good for that. They're typically short and efficient. They measure really necessary skills for kids. And the beautiful thing is that they're really sensitive to growth. So you can actually use them quite frequently, like weekly even, and they are so sensitive to growth that you will see kids improving. And what's beautiful about this is often these are our kids who struggle the most, and they don't see themselves as good readers. They have a hard time pointing to anything that says, I'm getting better, I'm becoming a good reader. And those progress monitoring tools, because they're so sensitive, and if you graph it, like you just do it on a basic graph, the kids can actually see themselves, right? What I like to do is share that and say, look at how much better you're getting. And it becomes this exciting opportunity to really, get that success for that kid, and then also share that with the parents because they often don't get that message.
Right. Michelle, could you give an example of that progress monitoring? Because I think sometimes people get confused between the benchmarking that's done and what's being used for benchmarking versus progress monitoring. And pretty soon you don't know what you're doing with the data you have.
Yeah. So the nice thing is those progress monitoring assessments often are the same assessments that we use for universal screening. Same in that it's the same suite. So for example, DIBELS or any of those CBM suites, Easy CBM, FastBridge, AimsWeb, any of those. They have specific assessments that you use to screen students for universal screening, all kids 3 times a year. The progress monitoring assessments are often similar, meaning it might be the same assessment that you also might use for universal screening, but what they do is they have multiple forms of the same difficulty level. So if you are using oral passage reading, having the students read aloud, because that's a really actually nice measure for general reading health, it's also a really nice measure to monitor kids' progress, to see if they are getting better, if they're getting if they're able to read more words accurately and at an appropriate pace, to know that they are becoming a good reader. Those assessments typically have at least 20 alternate forms of the same difficulty level that you can use to quickly and efficiently measure students' growth and graph it to share and see whether or not the student is making good progress. What's beautiful about that is if the student is not making good progress, I can see that pretty quickly because I'm frequently measuring their success. And if they are not growing at an appropriate rate, I can actually change my instruction. That is a signal for me to say, hey, this kid actually is not growing as quickly as we would think they would, given the good intervention they're getting. So it could be a mismatch in intervention. It could be maybe the kid is growing, but they actually need, I call it double dosing. They need more of that same intervention. So we don't throw it out. We try to tweak what we have and improve upon that. So there's lots of different ways to use that data, but it's usually very quick and efficient. Only 1 minute. Alternate forms, they have to be of the same difficulty level. And there's lots of, the National Center on Intensive Intervention has their tool charts. And I'm actually one of the technical reviewers for their progress monitoring tools. So we get to review these tools often, and it's a really good place to look for universal screening tools and progress monitoring tools, because they do a really nice job of reviewing what's commercially available for schools.
Would you say that again, so in case people miss that?
Yeah, so the National Center for Intensive Intervention.
Okay.
And if you Google that, and that, just so people know, that center is a spinoff of, it originally was the National Center for Progress Monitoring, which started like over 15 years ago. And then it was the National Center on RTI. And now it is the National Center for Intensive Intervention. So some of that work, and I've actually been at those centers, I've been doing work with them since the beginning. They have continued to do some of the things that they did originally, like the tool chart and reviewing interventions. So it's a really nice resource. In fact, I was on there the other day, and they even have examples of a good phonics lesson. And so they're really, it has a lot of nice resources on it.
That's great. We've put that in the chat for people to refer to. Before we move on, because I think we could stay on this point for a long time, I noticed a question from Barbara Daly Burns that we should probably touch on, because it sort of is leading to the next question I wanted to ask. And that is, with teachers feeling very overwhelmed, how do we instill that sense of urgency in our teachers? Any thoughts on that? I know it's a tough one. It's a good question, Barbara.
Yeah, it is a great question, Barbara. Honestly, I think by looking at the data, so, one of the things I mentioned in the blog is that, data is not our enemy, it's our friend. And right now, because of where we're at, we should actually be really thoughtful about the data we're collecting. And it seems that if we really embrace that and own that data as this is where our kids are at, no one's to blame, right? It's not because we didn't try. It's not because, teachers didn't show up. It's not because families weren't trying to, hook their kids on and engage, remotely. It's just where we're at. And so I think that by having a sense of a like real data to point to say, wow, we've got some growing to do. And so we have an opportunity here. And I also think it's an opportunity for schools to get behind their teachers who are exhausted for very good reasons and frustrated for very good reasons. And it just breaks my heart when I read these articles of these teachers, they can't wait to leave the teaching profession. And it is so sad. And so I think it's also an opportunity for us to embrace that data and also get behind our teachers, let them know that they're not in this alone, that this is a whole system. I mean, this is happening across the country. It's funny when I talk to schools, they're like, really? My data is not the only one that looks like this? I'm like, oh God, everybody's data looks like this. And so by just owning that and showing up and having some real support and intact understanding of these are the materials we're going to use. This is how we use them. This is how we get the best bang out of our buck for when we're teaching, English language arts. I think people have a hard time, it's kind of like that car accident that you drive by. You want to kind of look at it. It's like you don't want to see it, but you can't help but look at it. Our data is that. And I think we have to put it in front of people and start having that conversation. But really, really have teachers feeling supported in this and not like, oh my gosh, there's no way we're going to get out of this.
Well, you're alluding to something that's probably a bit of a statement of the obvious, which is that schools are probably not seeing a lot of growth from one testing period to another for all the reasons you said early on. If there was one thing they could do, if you could help focus on something, what would be your advice to help them with that lack of growth?
Yeah. So, and that is certainly happening that, they're screening in the beginning of the year and they're seeing all these kids at risk, and they're screening in the middle of the year, which just happened or is currently wrapping up. And they're still seeing a large portion of their kids at risk. And they're like, oh, that gap is still there. When we see so many kids struggling, that is not when we should be digging in and saying, so let's buy a new intervention. I think that's when we need to stay put and say, what is our tier 1 instruction? How we have so many kids that need us, that really the best use of our time and resource and focus is, let's look at our tier 1 instruction. Let's make sure that we, so things like, are teachers comfortable with those materials? Do they know how to teach those foundational skills? If they don't, then let's give them the support, right? Do they need some professional development? Do they need, some push-in support from some experts helping them co-teach for a little bit? Like, what are some things that we already have? I always say to schools, before you buy anything, dig through every single closet that you have and take an inventory of what you already know. And then try to figure out who owns this, meaning who is the person who's the expert at this? And if we needed to use this, do we have data or any support that says this intervention or this assessment really meets our needs because it answers these questions and we know we can get behind that? So I think it's important to really repurpose and reuse and focus on that tier 1. And the other thing I would say is, just because we have good materials and we have good intention doesn't mean that that is how it looks and feels. So, we always throw this word around, fidelity of implementation, but it is really important because programs were built by people, certainly smarter than me. So when reading programs are built, what I find interesting and fascinating is that they pull some of the best minds in the field together. So they pull a linguist, and they pull someone who knows vocabulary, and they pull someone who knows comprehension, and then they pull curriculum development folks, and they say, they talk to the experts and say, what are the most critical skills that need to be taught? And then they talk about, so how are we going to do that? And how are we going to put that together in one complete package? And so I think that it's really important to know that the reason why they built it that way is because they have either research to support it or science behind it that says, we know if teachers engage in these activities in these ways, it is highly likely that our kids will learn these skills. So that fidelity piece is really critical. And I think we can't just ask teachers, are you teaching it? Because they're going to say, yes, of course they're teaching it. What we want to know is, how well are they teaching it? Where do they need support? So,
Michelle, you said earlier, and I had a little sneak preview of some of this the other day too, that you have some recent data from California where they've been doing some of the steps that you're describing, and it might be interesting for people to get a specific example of how this works and what difference it makes, because I think it was really an aha moment for me to hear that.
It was an aha moment for me. So thank you for mentioning that. So there's a school district in California who, so they use Wonders as their general tier 1 curriculum. And then they have reading specialists. So what they have done is they have multiple assessments they're using. They use iReady, they use some CBM assessments for the younger grades. They're also using key phonics to screen. They are actually screening all of their kids in 3rd grade through 6th grade, because on key phonics, what it does is it will tell you, it's very short and quick. It only takes a couple minutes, but it will say, these are the 12 most critical phonics categories, like consonant, vowel, consonant, R controlled, vowel teams, prefixes, suffixes. And then it will tell, what they're doing is they're taking their data and they're saying, so which of our kids are still struggling with CVC pattern? And they are putting all of those kids in tier 2 interventions. And what they're doing is they are using the supplemental material. So they didn't go out and buy an intervention, say, oh, we have kids that are struggling with CVC and short vowels. What are we going to do? Wonders actually has all of these really nice materials that are already made for them. And so what's nice about that is that the kids already experience that curriculum, which has its kind of own flow and wording and books. And then they use that same curriculum, but it is a tier 2 intervention from Wonders to intensify. So these interventionists took their screening data and said, these are the kids that need short vowels. They put them into, it was literally 8 days. 8 days of intervention. And then they were giving them, we have diagnostic assessments that only take a couple minutes to give. So if it was a CVC intervention and they provided the CVC instruction from Wonders for tier 2, then they give key phonics diagnostic CVC patterns to make sure that the kids have it. And then they reconstitute those groups every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, they are moving kids up to the next skill. So what I love about that and what they talk about is that sense of urgency. They're like, we have 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders who don't have these critical skills. We have to fill in the hole, but we have to do it quickly and efficiently. So they're cross-grading these kids. So they're not just taking the 3rd graders. They are taking any kid who is struggling with that, right? And they are breaking them up and they're doing them. They were telling me about 5 students per intervention group. But what's nice is that they're only taking 8 days and they're seeing great success and they're moving these kids along. So they showed me their data from the beginning of the year and they had all of these kids that were struggling. And then they did universal screening again in the middle of the year. And these kids had gained so many critical skills. It was mind blowing. It really was amazing. So it's very efficient the way they're doing it. But what I love is that they're using the materials they have thoughtfully, right? They didn't go and buy something new. And that's really important for those kids because those kids who really struggle, every time we change the terminology for them, it's like, oh, wait a minute.
Starting over.
Yeah. Right. It's like my intervention teacher said this, but my general ed teacher said that. Yeah. What am I supposed to do? And so that's what I love about having a complete curriculum that really has a solid tier 1, that has the ability to beef up that tier 2 intervention.
And even if the program doesn't have it, that's a principle that's probably worth keeping in mind when we think about looking for tier 2 is maybe it's not go find a new program, but how to make more intensive what you're doing in tier 1. But speaking of program, that's a beautiful example. And maybe there'll be some questions that others will want to ask about what you just said, but just to continue on, that adage of materials don't teach, teachers teach. You said in your blog that there are 4 things that instruction should include, which is I translate to be what the teacher should be doing. It should be explicit, systematic, lots of opportunities to respond, and immediate feedback. So here's the big question is, so is there one of those that's more important than the other? So is there something that if you just had to get better at one of those things, you should focus on first? If I'm thinking of these overwhelmed people, like I can't do everything.
Yeah. So, when you first asked the question, I thought, yes, I know exactly what I want to say. But then I have to really think because all of those things are necessary, but not sufficient in and of themselves, right? I can be explicit in what I'm teaching. And what I mean by explicit is that the kid knows exactly what is being taught and why. One of my favorite things I used to do and still do when I have the opportunity, when I'm in classrooms, I like to go up to the students and I like to say, tell me what you're learning and why. And I will tell you, I can tell pretty quickly a classroom where a teacher has a very clear understanding of what their instruction is intended to do, because it's the difference of the student responding to me of, well, I'm learning how to become a better reader. Okay. Or the kid says to me, I'm learning my short vowels because my teacher says I'm going to have to read lots of words with short vowels. And so it's going to help me become a better reader. And I'm like, that teacher has clear intention and that kid knows exactly what's going on. And so that really is the explicitness, right? Of the kid knows exactly why we're telling them what to do and understands what the teacher's teaching. But if we don't do that in a systematic way, right? If we don't have a good roadmap, like we can't jump in, it doesn't make sense to teach multisyllabic words with really complex patterns before kids know more simplistic words with, very clear letter sound correspondence patterns. So it has to be systematic. And most programs, I will tell you, because I've looked at a lot of reading curriculums, have a very thoughtful scope and sequence of skills. They're not all the same though, which is really interesting. And there is no empirical data that says kids have to learn this before they learn that. What we do know is that what we teach kids, they'll learn. But most of the programs are built on some common sense things, right? Like they're not going to do multisyllabic words before kids can read single syllable words. So you have to have all of happening, right? You have to be explicit. It has to be systematic. It has to have rhyme and reason and make sense. The opportunities to respond, I mentioned this in my blog, that those kids who struggle the most need many, 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 many opportunities to respond. It's not one and done. And yes, some kids will get that, but the majority of our kids won't. And particularly for those kids who are most at risk, they need many opportunities to respond. But here's the kicker. They can't be responding incorrectly. And so if I had a favorite that I think out of those things that I think I like to talk about and try to get people to get excited about is the corrective feedback, the immediate corrective feedback. And I think I mentioned in the blog the example of, and we've all done this, right? Where we meet somebody and we think we heard their name right, but we didn't. And then we say their name 3 times. Like if someone, met me and I said Michelle and they said Mary, and they kept calling me Mary for 3 more times. And then I finally felt bad enough to say, I'm really sorry. Mary's a lovely name, but my name's Michelle. The next time they go to call me my name, the first thing that's going to come into their head is Mary. So now I've made that task that much more difficult because they're going to access Mary because they've practiced it. Now they're going to have to access Mary, scratch it and go, oh, that's not right. And then they have to find the connection to, wait, what is it? What is it? It's Michelle. So when we let kids practice skills incorrectly to discover stuff, we are doing a huge disservice because every opportunity that we have a kid focus and practice, we are making those neural connections, like synapses are going off, right? Like that's really cool, but they have to be going off in the right sequence in the right order so that the next time the kid sees it, it's actually supposed to be easier because that groove in the brain is becoming deeper and correct. But if we let that groove to develop and it's incorrect, now we've made it very hard for those kids to access the correct information. So I think, it's funny. Someone once said that their swimming coach used to say to them, practice is not enough. Perfect practice is what we need. And I think people are like, ugh, it doesn't have to be perfect. And that is true for some things, right? Like inventive spelling and those types of things have a place. But when we're talking about, does the kid understand that the short A says ah and not eh? That's not something we want them to be confused about. That is something we want to practice correctly right from the start. And we want them doing it lots of times. And so that opportunity for kids to respond and that opportunity for immediate corrective feedback is huge. And I think it's something that we don't really, we think, oh, it's okay, they're making a couple mistakes, they'll catch on. And I think we need to really understand that, particularly for those kids that struggle, you're setting them up for a harder path for learning. And we want to break those bad connections and we want to connect the good neurons for the right answers.
And I think what you're describing goes back to that relationship between kids who are spending time in tier 1 and tier 2, that the more those are aligned, the more efficient it is. As I'm listening to you, it seems that it's not only that not only do we need to teach the right things and in the right way, but we need to accelerate learning in this crisis. So, you perhaps touched on this, but maybe delve a little more into what could help or what can help accelerate learning. And I'm assuming probably somewhere in here, the data can help us accelerate learning. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there's so much we could say, Nancy. And I'm sure that there are people who are joining us who have their own ideas, and maybe they can share those as well. I think one of the things that I think we really need to come to terms with. And this, it's so funny because this goes back to my Reading First days, where we actually were external evaluators for a state during Reading First Day. So we got to go in and do lots of observations and train teachers, and we collected gobs of data on teachers and kids. And one of the things that we saw successful schools doing was really coveting those instructional minutes. So meaning, it was simple things, but if we're talking about we only have so much time and we want to start accelerating, they did things like the loudspeaker time in the morning for sharing things was minimized. The interruptions during the day on the loudspeaker was minimized or taken out completely. Like no longer were they doing these big announcements and disrupting class time for that, right? It was little things like that. But then the teachers also got really thoughtful about, my kids are coming in and there is this 10-minute mushy time between when they enter my door and when we actually start for the day. So instead of just letting them, silently read or do something, they had thoughtful, really targeted practice lessons that the kids worked on. So it wasn't just like, well, be quiet and sit in your seat. The other thing teachers did with that time was they used that time to test kids. So teachers that were saying to me, I can't possibly progress monitor my kids because I don't have time to do it. And I said, well, do you have any downtime? And so what ended up happening is that we were working with a classroom and the teacher actually just had a schedule. So on Monday, these two kids came up to her desk, when they entered the room at the beginning of the day to do progress monitoring. And then on Tuesday, so the kids got into the routine. So the teachers were really thoughtful about teaching those routines and also minimizing those transition times. I remember I was observing a teacher and she was brilliant. This was a teacher who had, we all use this expression, but this was true for this teacher, eyes in the back of her head. I was actually sitting in the middle of her classroom. And so her kids behind me were at their desk or in small groups doing activities. And she was working at her table at the front with a small group of kids. And she looked at me and she said, is he working? And it was a kid sitting behind me. She couldn't even see him, but I turned around and I was like she knew, right? Like she had eyes in the back of her head. This was a teacher that was on it. One of the things we noticed though, is that every time she changed an activity, she would bring the kids back to the carpet, right? And then she would explain the activity. And so we started counting the minutes of that lost instructional time. And she was losing like up to 15 minutes during her English language blocks, just in those transitions. And she was like, I don't need to do that. I just need to teach them the routine, ring the bell and say, you've got 1 minute to swap, and get to your next station, whatever. And so if you think about that, 15 minutes a day lost to transitions, what she was gaining over time was amazing. So I know that sounds quirky, but those are things that I think we lose sight of, like where are our minutes going and how can we recapture them? I think the other thing is having teachers work together. So I think people are feeling overwhelmed. And I think one of the things to accelerate learning is we've got to get out of this mindset of, well, I don't teach those skills because the kids were supposed to get it in that grade. Well, guess what? It's a whole new world and kids actually need to be taught those skills. So how about if we figure out, how do we swap materials? How do we have a third grade teacher have access to some second grade content where kids actually need some of that refresher or actually, learning from the ground up. So I think we could be thinking about when we're accelerating, how do we capture those minutes, really, really capture those minutes? And how do we get the materials in teachers' hands so that they're not floundering, so that they know, and again, that's all driven by our data, right? So if we know which kids are at risk and we know what are those skills that these kids need, and then we give the teacher the support and the materials and help them find those extra minutes, boy, we could really, really start talking about accelerating.
We have a question that kind of, I think you've been answering this last few minutes of what can teachers do now, this week, next week for their students and themselves. What I just heard you say is be sure you're using every minute efficiently. I mean, some of these things are not maybe what you'd expect, but you're, finding more time to really devote to what the kids need to be learning. And I think that is a really helpful way to frame this. It's, I can't imagine, but maybe I'm wrong, that people don't have the assessment information. So if that's the case, that they don't, where would, of all these assessment levels or layers of assessment, where should people go first? What would you recommend first?
Yeah.
Or
I think
next?
it depends on what the question is, right?
Yes,
So
right.
if the question is, I'm not sure who's at risk, right? I think I know who's at risk, because one of the things about universal screeners that I love is that it will often catch those kids who fly under the radar, who have kind of good compensatory strategies. They're quiet, there are good students, but when we actually capture data, we can see that it's kind of falling apart a little, and they do need some support. So one of the things I would say is, if the question is who really needs help, then get a good universal screener and screen everybody, but make sure it's quick, it's efficient, it's focusing on the right skills, and it can actually help you answer that question. Who in my classroom is really needing additional help? So that is for that question. If the question is, I kind of know who's at risk, what I'm not sure is what I'm supposed to be teaching them, right? Like, what are they at risk in? So that's where I would say it depends on your grade level, right? If I'm working with kindergarten kids, then I really need to understand, where are their phonological awareness skills? So I might want to use, actually, CORE has a good phonological awareness kind of diagnostic tool. There's the CTOP, right? There's other types of diagnostic tools that people could use and say, I really need to understand what I should be focusing on for these kids who really are, I'm worried about, right? Giving them a letter sound task. Do they know their letters and their sounds? It's great that they know their names, but we know that the sounds of the letters are closer to the actual task of reading. And that is really something we need to really get to quickly. So even with phonological awareness, people are like, as soon as the kid has the sound, put the letters in front of them. Because again, we have to think about every opportunity is for that kid to have that connection, those neurons firing and those grooves happening, and the right efficient way for them to continue to learn. If it's what phonics skills do they need, there are, I would say, get a good phonics screener to do that. Of course, I would recommend Key Phonics, but there's other ones out there as well. If it's vocabulary, testing a kid's vocabulary. And the other thing I would say is that we know a lot about how, and we're learning more about the science of reading, right? But one of the things that I keep thinking about is, even when we're thinking about, we think we have the right skill, what I would say is, don't over-test, get to teaching. And really pay attention to what the kid is doing. Look at it, look at their spelling. Spelling tells you a lot about, the correlation between reading and spelling, and phonics and spelling, is really strong. It's not a perfect correlation, and they're highly related, but it is another piece of data that's easy for teachers to look at to understand, is this kid growing? And when you think about your using your data, you also have to think about, don't just teach words in isolation. That's not helpful. Incorporate those writing tasks. We know that the act of writing can really help kids solidify that. So use those same decoding patterns for their spelling words. Have them write them in sentences, right? Even in kindergarten, have them do writing with their letter sounds. Making sure that they're reading connected text, right? It's not okay for them just to look at a word on a page and read it, because that's not the goal. The goal is for them to read in connected text. So making sure they have access to that. And the other thing I would say is, teachers often know or have a good clue on what a kid needs. If you think you have the data, then just go teach. It's when you really are scratching your head and you're not sure, that's when the assessments are absolutely 100% critical.
I think is the risk of thinking that if you spend enough time testing, that will be the answer, but that's the teaching in between the testing that becomes critical. I'm sure I could keep asking you questions all night, but I'd like to see if there are any questions that folks would like to ask that are in our group this evening. If not, as I say, I can always keep asking questions. But is there anything that anyone would like to bring up that we haven't touched upon, or you'd like Michelle to elaborate on?
I have a question, Nancy. Michelle, you had touched on computer adaptive assessments, and I think you were alluding to their ability to kind of free up time. But can you touch on sort of the accuracy and validity of like a computer adaptive assessment, especially for our kids who have attention problems or distractibility, versus assessments that are, where the teacher is actually administering the assessment themselves?
Yeah, Bonnie, I love that question. So it's funny because I kind of, there are pros and cons to every assessment, right? So I'll talk about the pros for computer adaptive, what I see as some of the pros, and then I'll share the cons, kind of what you're alluding to. So I think the pros is that often they can be group administered, right? So you can get the kids into the computer lab and they're all sitting in front of the assessment. The other thing about computer adaptive assessments is that they are supposed to be able to put the kid into the assessment and then they adjust based on how the student responds to that answer. So for example, usually it happens at a grade level, all the kids start with the same question. And depending on how this kid, I answer that question, I'm either going to get a harder question or I'm going to get an easier question. And so it will give me the items that are appropriate to my skills. And then in that way, it actually is matched and is a good representation of my skills as a student. So those things are helpful because if they have enough items on certain skills that a kid engages with and responds to, you could potentially get some specific information out of that, right? Like this kid is actually struggling with vocabulary in this area, or phonics skills in this area, or letters and sounds in this area, right? Here, so all those things are positive. Here are the things that I think are the cons, kind of what you alluded to. The student never has to read or respond aloud. Actually, that's changing though. There are some assessments actually that are now using speech recognition, and it's getting better and better and better. So once that really comes into its own, I think I'll feel much better because the kids actually have to read aloud. So the kids are only identifying for the most part, right? So they see the question, they get to respond, which of these is correct, or pick the picture that matches the sound. And it's identifying. They actually don't have to produce the sound. They actually don't have to read the words. So that is a caution, right? Because that is a different skill level. I can identify, but I actually may not be able to produce. And what we want is we want kids to actually be producing sounds and words. The other thing is that as a classroom teacher, because it's adaptive, all of my students don't answer the same questions. So the data that I look at is really specific to a kid. And I don't get a sense of all of my kids were assessed on these 50 questions. And I know from these 50 questions and these skills, how everybody is doing. The other thing is that they can take a long time. So depending on how the kid responds, the kid could be sitting there for a while. So there are pros and cons to that. I am a firm believer that it's very important to hear a kid read aloud. And so I think that if people are using computer adaptive assessments, and some people love them, I would say for those kids that you think are potentially more at risk, it is worth pulling them and actually administering some type of assessment where you are listening to that student read aloud. And by the way, I do think there's great benefit for a teacher to listen to every single student in their class, even if it's just for a minute, reading aloud, to read aloud, because as a special educator, I can tell you, I've listened to many kids. I've administered hundreds and hundreds of reading assessments. And when you listen to poor readers all the time, you actually start thinking, okay, well, that's typical. when I hear a good reader and I hear the inflection in their voice and they're actually reading as if they're the author of that material, I go, whoa, that's a good reader. And so it really readjusts of what my goal is, right? I want all of my kids to have that skill. And if I'm listening to those kids that are struggling, I actually get a little skewed on what I think good is.
Wow. Are there any other questions out there that we'd like to add before we run out of time this evening? So Michelle, what gives you the most hope in the face of this crisis?
That teachers are amazing and they show up every day in these crazy situations, and they have the strength to do this day after day because they believe, they know they have the power to change kids' lives. And so it is the teachers who inspire me. And it is when they see success in their kids and the kids get excited. I can do that all day long, but it's hard. And I think we all need to be in this together, and we have to stop using assessments to penalize teachers and making them feel bad. I think it's just horrible. Like, we really need to say, this is the data, this is where our kids are at, and this is where we're starting, and this is how we're all going to move the ship forward.
Well, to help people do that, we'd like to mention two things coming up. If people would like to hear more of the topic that Michelle's talking about, there is a session that was actually how we came to see the blog, which is on February the 8th.
I'm putting that in the chat.
Yep, we have that in the chat if anyone's interested in more details about this topic, right, Michelle?
Yeah, it's a free webinar that is being sponsored by Core and Pivot, who are some of my partners out in California. Wonderful folks, amazing. And so I'm presenting with a colleague from Core and a colleague from Pivot, and we're focusing on tier 2, right? So we're going to talk about what's supposed to happen in tier 1, but we're really going to dig into tier 2. We're going to talk about diagnostic data. We're going to talk about what instruction should look like. And of course, it's all focusing on reading, but we're going to be doing that next week.
And then I know there's another event that you and Jan Hasbrook are doing on February 24th. It's a Thursday at, I think, 4 o'clock Eastern time. And I don't know if you have that information, but it's through the collaborative classroom. Maybe we can find that and send that out. But because I think
it is through the collaborative classroom. And I apologize, I don't have a link. So again, I believe that that's a free webinar that they're providing. But the topic that Jan Hasbrook and I, who's amazing, the topic for that one is demystifying reading assessments, the right assessment for the right purpose. So it's got to be all about assessments, like, why do you use one this way? And we're actually going to talk about and share some examples. And Jan knows a ton about assessments too. So it should be a lot of fun.
Well, it sounds like you'll go back to those questions. You said, what do you want to know? And then what should you be using to do it? Well, we can't thank you enough for coming to join us on such short notice. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so very much. And thanks to everyone who joined us this evening.
Thank you, Nancy.
Just to mention, I think the date on the chat, it says February 16th, but I think you guys both alluded to it. It's February 8th, right?
Yeah, actually, thank you for, and actually that was sent to me by the person who's hosting. Thank you so much for saying that. Yes, it is the 8th.
Yes, the 8th. I'm sure it's the 8th.
Yeah. When you click on the link, it does go to the 8th, but I just wanted everybody to know that
it's not the 16th.
Oh, thank you for catching that.
And it's at 3:45. Well, actually, it's from 4 to 5 our time.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for that catch, Bonnie. And Michelle, again, thank you. And thanks to everyone who took time to join us this evening.
Yes, thank you.
Good luck with your teaching.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, everyone.